Plate.
Plate, yes, plate.
Plate.
Yeah.
Plate.
See, we don't need them.
Plate?
Yeah.
In the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, following the Great Flood in the Age of Moses, humanity all spoke the same language, and was unified under the lingua franca, allowing them to create untold marvels of human innovation, ingenuity, and construction, culminating in the aforementioned tower, which was to be built as high as to reach God. Displeased by this display of hubris, God sent his angels to confound their language such that they would not understand one another's speech. Suddenly, the people of Babel lost their ability to understand their friends, their colleagues, their family, their words stricken from their minds and mouths, and in the chaos that ensued, the tower crumbled and the people scattered themselves across the world to live amongst those who now spoke the same language. Can you imagine a world without shared words, without a common tongue? And I mean all words. That doesn't just include spoken language, but written language. And it doesn't even need to include sounds, as deaf people communicate expediently using gestures that can convey the same kind of complex meaning that vocalizations or writing can. Emphasizing certain signs can completely alter or change the meaning of a sentence in ASL. I've certainly seen a friend of mine fluent in it be perhaps more expressive when she's signing them when speaking, much in the same way that vocalized communication can add inflections to indicate sarcasm, contempt, of flirtatiousness even, ooh woo. But a world without words? Given that humans are a social species, we cannot survive alone. If the confounding of language that's told in the story of Tower of Babel were to suddenly happen today, could you even imagine the utter chaos? How could we possibly work together in such an environment without the capacity for mutual communication? Recently, I spoke about memes and how simplistic memes or vocalizations may tend to spread more likely across general networks. And in the process, I talked about how memes have the capacity to convey very complex meaning in a very simplistic, minimal way, so as to reduce the time need be spent thinking about something. But also because it has positive outcomes for social cohesion and may serve as a quick way of indicating warning or threats, at least from an evolutionary standpoint. The story of Babel in Genesis provides us with a picture of the past that reflects what modern cultural evolutionary theorists actually believe may have been the case for Homo sapiens. In his 2017 book, A Different Kind of Animal: How Culture Transformed Our Species, Dr. Robert Boyd lays out a history of human speech as being the precursor to culture, being the rationale for why we began to diverge into unique communities and ethnicities, away from any kind of common ancestor tongue, or more likely, what we probably had were simple sounds that conveyed meanings in our primate ancestors, something we can still see in primate species today. Grooming takes a long time, gestures take a lot less, and vocalizations take the least amount of time to convey social information, such that apes with the more complex social communities are also the ones who won't shut up. And that propensity is nowhere more clearly elucidated than in Homo sapiens.
And if there's one thing I can do, it's talk. I've got 5 billion languages and you haven't got one way of stopping me. So if anybody's gonna shut up, it's you! Okie doke, so where were we?
But socialization is much more difficult when we lack even a common tongue. Boyd proposes that at some point in time, our ancient ancestors spoke a shared sort of language, but over time, they tend to separate from one another. They developed their own languages, cultures, and adaptations for where they lived, and such over the course of 40,000 years, this splintering process of language, which was based probably on an original true lingua franca of Homo sapiens, even if it was just grunts, has produced the myriad of cultures, genetics, and most importantly, speech and language that we find in modernity. But this makes me curious. What would the basic structure of communications of our ancient ancestors look like? And do our ancient proclivities re-emerge from our genetic memory, allowing us to adapt when we lack a common language? What is the most basic unit of language, and what need be its complexity to allow people to work together? Going all the way back to Babel. I want to draw your attention then this time not to a bunch of studies, although of course there will be plenty of those, but rather an analysis of a video game that lacks words as a framework. So today, let's look back on the 2012 video game Journey, a social game that exists in a world without words. This video is both a retrospective on one of, if not the best game of that year, but also a framework to better understand human language, as it serves as an excellent example of how little we actually need in terms of social information for two people to work together, because we're evolved to do it. And in the case of Journey, crucial information can be exchanged, much as with birds, who are similarly social in their nature to humans and are also prone to mimetics, through the form of bird call. In Journey, all that's needed to communicate is a simple chirp. But for first, let me tell you about this video's sponsor, NordVPN. Because if you're into 45-minute long videos that apply cultural evolution theory to a 7-year-old video game, you know, something just a little bit weird, you might want to protect your browsing history and privacy online. With social media giants like Facebook and Google facing antitrust investigation by the US government, privacy is becoming increasingly scarce on the web. Rated as the best VPN in 2018, Nord is the top choice for staying secure, protected, and anonymous on the internet. I've been using Nord for a while now, not just because they allow me to browse anonymously, but because they offer a great service that allows you to connect from 62 countries and counting. It even works in China. So if you're like me, with Nord, now you too can roleplay as an Australian man on a Mongolian underwater basket weaving forum. Come across a video that's not available in your country? Nord allows you to easily and quickly connect from another country to access that content. And with unlimited bandwidth and super fast servers, Nord is my personal recommendation in VPNs. Plus, it's risk-free with a 30-day money-back guarantee, and it's a great deal. If you go to the link in my description box, you get a whole 75% off discount on a 3-year plan from NordVPN. That's only $2.99 a month to protect your privacy. You don't even have to pay with a credit card, as Nord accepts both PayPal and Bitcoin. With growing censorship and the future of a free internet in question now more than ever, NordVPN can provide you with the security and protection you need to freely enjoy weird videos like this one. So, let's get back to Journey, the social video game without language. Journey was released in 2012 by that game company. That's their name, I didn't just forget it or something. A team of indie developers that previously released the critically acclaimed game Flower, which itself was a spiritual successor to an earlier project, Flow. Flower, get it? In Flow, you play a microscopic creature, while in Flower, you control a petal flying on the breeze. Ooh, so nice and comfy. While both games are enjoyable, and certainly very easy on the eye to say the least. And with Flower featuring a dynamic soundtrack that changes with player movement, they aren't exactly what I would call game experiences, more than just, you know, experiences. While there are levels that progress in Flower, there's no real capacity for failure beyond the player just giving up. In Journey, the team's next project, they carried over many of the things that they learned and implemented in both Flow and Flower, including a lack of a fail state, but also bringing back the dynamic music score that changes as the player behaves differently, is faced with different challenges, or enters different areas, which unlike Flower, all fluidly blending into each other into a singular linear game. And it takes about an hour to an hour and a half to finish, immediately prompting you to start a new journey. There is no combat, there are no items beyond collectible glyphs, and there's only minor puzzles that can be completed more easily by collecting the glyphs, but are not needed to finish the game. While you can interact with other players, the game gives you no real incentive to do so beyond socialization or maybe hoping that they help you find some of these glyphs, but if you're not interested in doing it, again, you're not incentivized to. If you're interested in picking up Journey, I should note that it recently was finally released for the PC on June 6th of 2019 via the Epic Games Store, and the footage that you're seeing comes from that version. Which is okay, although I did experience a crash, and I won't get into the debate over whether or not the Epic Games Store is moral or unethical, by gobbling up previously exclusive titles like Journey. But I have to say that this release does widely broaden access to a really beautiful game. You might be thinking, wait a minute, if you can't lose, you don't have to socialize. How is Journey not just a social game, but a game at all? And while I really want to assess the language and the mechanics as well as the thematic elements of Journey, I think first I need to discuss whether or not this is actually a game, let alone a social game, given that it does have no fail states. So first let's discuss what a game is by looking at the classical theory of the magic circle. Huizinga in 1938 first proposed the idea of play as socially agreed upon set of arbitrary rules which are agreed upon by the entrants in an environment that exists outside of normal life, in what he describes as a magic circle. Although he only briefly mentions the exact term magic circle a couple of times in his famous work, Homo Ludens, Man the Player. Get the hell out of my head, Kojima!
The memes.
Huizinga posits all play moves and has its being within a playground marked off beforehand either materially or ideally, deliberately or as a matter of course. Just as there is no formal difference between play and ritual, so the consecrated spot cannot be formally distinguished from the playground. The arena, the card table, the magic circle, the temple, the stage, the screen, the tennis court, the court of justice, etc. all are in form and function playgrounds, temporary worlds within ordinary worlds, dedicated to the performance of an act apart. In other words, games exist within a specific set of rules that all the players have agreed upon in an imaginary realm which exists within our minds and is governed by these rules. This means that play often appears meaningless. What is the purpose of a race? Did the runners get anywhere? No, they ran a dang circle. To an alien observer, this game must seem like beyond absurdist.
This is a school?
It's part of it. We call this the playground.
What is it for?
I'll just watch.
Yet there are rules that we attribute to this otherwise seemingly meaningless activity of play, for Huizinga further posits that play is anything but meaningless, instead stating play is, quote, a significant function, that is to say, there is some sense to it. In play there is something at play which transcends the immediate needs of life and imparts meaning to the action. All play means something. Children play to learn valuable behaviors through imitation, such as imitating domestic life by playing house, or they learn to abide by social rules, warming the bench after getting knocked out in dodgeball. They learn to share. They learn socialization. Also, apparently dodgeball is sexist now, because of course it is. Anyway, what defines meaningful play if the things that we typically consider games, sports, video games, tabletop games, are meaningful play? Salen and Zimmerman 2003 in their treatise on play specify that play only has meaning through the interaction of players with the established system. A chessboard, its pieces, and all of its rules can exist, but it's meaningless if no one plays chess. Players and their actions, and the response to that action within the game system, that relationship is what allows the game to take on meaning, to make it a game.
With each new consequence, the game begins to take shape.
And you have no idea what that shape is until it is completed.
That's right. In fact, the game wouldn't be worth playing if we knew what was going to happen.
Under this definition, all of the magic cards that are sitting around me right now are not a game because I'm not playing magic. I guess it's like Schrodinger's cards. It's only a game if there is a player there to play it. Yet they also posit that not all games are equally meaningful. To be a truly meaningful game and not just a random action or a set of rules that no one follows, games need to be discernible and integrated. Discernibility refers to the capacity for a player to see the outcome of their actions. I push this button, something happens. I move these cards in an agreed upon way, then I put down a card in response to my actions, and then the other player must move cards from their library into their graveyard. Action, outcome. Just as the look of utter contempt on the face of anyone playing Magic against me because Mill for Life son is an outcome. Albeit not part of the stated rules, just an added bonus to see the suffering. But without being able to observe outcomes, we would be just randomly pushing buttons or throwing cards about like it's Dankula's bachelor party. The second aspect, integration, contains not just the immediate system response, but the long-term response. If I don't save my ink ribbons, the method used for saving in Resident Evil, I could easily screw myself over later in the game because of a prior poor decision to not save any. I argue Journey is a meaningful, true game, despite lacking a fail state, as each playthrough can result in you gaining glyphs or losing a scarf to cloth eaters, which that's more of the integration stuff, and the controls are simple and responsive. That's the discernible stuff. As for the social nature of the game, well, yes, you can choose to not interact with anybody, but it is always online and there is a possibility you will run into somebody. It's just your choice whether or not you want to interact. And the social rules of this magic circle are created collaboratively between players. But what if I don't want to collaborate? When we talk about rules in games, it's kind of impossible to not mention the cheater. To cheat is to step outside of the magic circle and its agreed upon rules, and it's been a long-standing critique of the magic circle concept, because if we've created this boundary-based system, how can someone step outside of it?
Cheating! You've been caught cheating! Time stopped! You've been caught cheating!
We're on the same team, dude. Look, Frank, cheating is tolerated, it's accepted, it's like a big part of the game, but if you get caught cheating, they advance to the next level.
We can cheat precisely because we know the circle is farcical, it's magic. As Fine 1983 states of play, the real world will always intrude, for the gaming structure is not impenetrable to outside events. And thus, sometimes, yes, people will cheat. But as Taylor 2006 found, players may report cheating as being fun or necessary, but cheaters also generally enjoy the game less. They seem to feel ashamed of their actions. Further, Dr. Mia Consalvo, in her work Cheating, Gaining Advantage in Video Games, found that players tend to have their own definitions of what they think cheating is based on their own previous behavior, all illustrating a compelling argument that the magic circle does not have such defined boundaries of following these precise rules that Huizinga kind of originally posited. Even though breaking them likely makes us feel less accomplished and less likely to enjoy the experience, having to redefine cheating to explain our own behavior, perhaps out of shame, precisely because it violates a social norm. Even when we're being antisocial and cheating, the taboo of violating the circle is inherently social because it is a social contract. It's not so much a magic circle then, so much as it is a magic suggestion?
Cheating seems to be a relevant term only when one is caught in the act. Otherwise, it is viewed as intelligence. No?
So while there will always be cheaters and trolls, there's little opportunity to cheat, no real positive gain to the player in a simple, linear, anonymous experience like Journey to troll anybody. But I think considering there is an opportunity to mess with others and break game rules if you feel so inclined, in addition to being a game with integrated and discernible meaning, we can say Journey is a game, and while it can be alone, with only one actor in the system, it also is a social game wherein players collaboratively create language to assist one another in completing game goals. So with all of that put aside, Journey is a game. Now let's talk about that game. Journey begins with several shots of a seemingly endless sea of glistening, blistering sand, from which you, me, us, the player-controlled character, awakes after a shooting star flies over the landscape. As you are quickly prompted to get up and look around, there is nothing but an infinite ocean of golden sand dotted with strange rock statues, perhaps menhirs or graves. Desolate, or so it seems, until you move forward and come across a massive mountain emitting glowing light and dominating the skyline. We have awoken alone, and without any memory or indication of who we are, let alone where we are, with no indication of what direction to head in beyond to go straight forward towards the light. The desert seemingly goes on forever, and this area actually is quite large. If the player wishes, he or she can mull around in this barren sea to his or her heart's content, because there is no real call to action beyond seeing the light, emitting from a lone mountain, similarly to ourselves, standing in this endless desert. As you wander, you'll come across a statue. This is actually the only thing that I think is required to finish the game, because the statue bequeaths you with the power of cloth, which is bestowed upon the player by a word or glyph that comes out of the statue and gives them a scarf, which reacts whenever the player character stands near other cloth, giving the temporary ability to fly, which is necessary to solve puzzles, but I'm fairly sure you can get through the entire game with just this first glyph. In terms of what this means thematically, while standing near other cloth, you will charge up your fabric meter, and you'll get a little boost by holding the X button.
Perhaps you can queef, make yourself go faster, like a little power boost,
which produces both a chirping sound and a light, small glyph. Here we already see the power of words interacting with the power of magic that's locked within this cloth. The ability to control and draw magic from the cloth is given to you by a symbol, and it's activated by a symbol, a word. And your sound, the chirp. The chirp also activates hieroglyphs that display a visual history of the game world as you progress. We can already see the power that language holds in this game, albeit a language that is incomprehensible to us. But what makes this interesting is that the language isn't just a mystery to me, a longtime fan of the game, it's a mystery to anyone who picks it up. This is nonsensical, it's just a small sound and a meaningless symbol. But we're able to impart meaning upon it, precisely because we all universally are unable to understand what this chirp is supposed to mean. So therefore we can replace it with the meaning we desire. This is a really cool integration of gameplay mechanics and thematics. After solving some simple puzzles, which naturally teach the player about how to fly and how to use the cloth, the player enters a new area with a collapsed bridge. And it's here where Journey begins to diverge from a typical single-player experience, because it's in this area when the player can first encounter another player online. And playing it now, even 7 years after it came out, I still find people online at almost any time of day. One interesting element in Flow was the pinging system to indicate a goal for the player to move towards. This was both a sound and a simple circular shape on the side of the screen that indicated where the next meal was for the microscopic play character in Flow. This concept was carried over to Journey, but in a way that's much more powerful, with a slight glow appearing on the screen to illustrate not where the next goal is, but where another player is. After slothing through a desolate and lonely landscape that is dotted by what really appeared to be tombstones and a crumbled, collapsed civilization, this sign of the chirp of another player does not necessarily indicate a specific goal beyond the goal of socialization. Now knowing that you're not on this journey alone. Other players also utilize a similar chirp as yourself, but not all players look the same, as their experience with the game is indicated by the complexity of the glyphs and symbols on their own cloaks. But at this point, if you have run across someone, the player can choose to follow the other player around and work together to solve some puzzles and explore this world, or they can go on by their lonesome. However, there is a bit of a benefit to following a more experienced player, who knows where all the glyphs are, for example, or who knows how to evade enemies. And for some people, there might just be a benefit in merely interacting with another person after having spent so much time alone. Even if it only takes about 5 to 10 minutes to get through the opening part of Journey, the somber music, the seemingly endless desert sea, at least makes me feel like an island, and it's always a welcome sight to see another player. Again, both of your languages reduced to chirps, but from my experiences as well, these chirps are quickly adapted to express complex information between the players, with a quick chirp often indicating danger and a long chirp indicating a collectible of interest. However, these norms are not set in stone by the developers. They're created collaboratively between two players in every session. And there's some research evidence for that, as suggested by the social identity model of de-individuation effects, or SIDE. A meta-analysis on SIDE from Postmus, Spears, and Leah 1998 describes interest in SIDE arising from an attempt to understand how group norms would form in an anonymous environment, such as in the case with many online games, Journey among them. In anonymous environments, we and others are stripped of our identity, and thus, SIDE predicts that people will develop norms collectively to replace that lack of personal identity. Their research has shown that groups of people interacting anonymously do develop behaviors and language that appears bizarre and anti-normative to an outside observer, yet is actually quite typical within the group. And we can see this quite easily, right? I mean, send your Nana to 4chan and see how she responds.
Hello, computer.
but a study from Postma, Spears, and Leah 2000 examined this effect specifically in the assessment of language patterns from students using a free statistics course called Mr. Stat, and allowed them to exchange anonymous emails with one another. Oh yeah boy, you know they were gonna come up with some sick, spicy statistic memes in their little groups. They did find, though, that across these groups of anonymous students, they began to develop their own unique mannerisms of speaking that were disparate and distinct over the course of an average of 32.7 hours using the program. People developed their own ways of communicating through a freaking statistics course mailing list. So yeah, particularly when we're anonymous, we invent our own ways of getting a message across which are unique to our current interaction with another partner, either in a dyad or in a group. We collaboratively create language in anonymous social groups together. Thus, in an anonymous game like Journey, which does not display player information until the credits, and which does not allow for complex forms of communication beyond the simple chirp, the ways in which two players can come to utilize these chirps can evolve independently across a single gameplay session. For example, while I would usually chirp very quickly to indicate danger to another player, other dyads may instead use the long chirp for such a meaning, or medium-length chirps, multiple or singular chirps. I may also change my manner of chirping in response to the behavior of another player. In this way, two players can take the most basic of linguistic tools provided to them and collaboratively create a functional, if simplistic, language. So with this synergistic language construction in mind, let's go back to the plot of Journey. Throughout the game, more and more is revealed through the imagery that illustrates the cloaked figures coming to harness the power of the cloth in order to build the advanced civilization that you are wandering through the ruins of, and that the leaders of the society are those clad in white cloaks, enigmatic figures that you also interact with in short cutscenes. Interestingly, depending on your own experience, you may have met another white cloak in your journey, as getting a white cloak is a reward for collecting the 21 characters or glyphs that are scattered throughout the game, and they symbolize game experience or seniority, as emphasized in short cutscenes and story sequences that show the white cloaks as physically much larger than the player character. But once again, we see the power of words in Journey. Words give us the power to control the cloth, and those who have access to all of the words, all of the glyphs, are the seniority figures. Further, white cloaks constantly regenerate their scarf energy and can transfer it to nearby players. Again, those with the greatest understanding of the glyphs and language is gifted with greater control of the in-game world's technology or resource analog, the cloth. While there are stealth portions of the game that require players to sneak past giant cloth-eating mechanical monstrosities that will destroy your scarf, as I said before, the game has no fail state. The worst that can happen is for your scarf to be destroyed, yet the game is completable in this state. After traversing through dangerous caverns of these cloth eaters, the players emerge at the top of the frozen peak of the glowing mountain, with cold winds continually destroying the power in their scarves. Yet if you have a friend, you can huddle together for temporary respite from the biting cold.
I was told once that the best way to regenerate body heat is to crawl naked into a sleeping bag with somebody else who's already naked.
Maybe if it rains sleeping bags, you'll get lucky.
And finally, after all the trials you have faced, the music begins to peak as you begin to approach the summit, only to see your friend fall, cold and lifeless by your side, followed by your own player character. And just when all hope seems lost, you are gifted with infinite energy and allowed to soar above the clouds to the top of the mountain and arrive at the source of the light, which you then enter, perhaps with your friend, as a shooting star flashes across the sky, only to end once again in the endless desert and prompting you to start a new journey, while showing you the names of any players you met along the way. And as I've said, you can play the game alone. Playing it with another person and reaching this moment is truly cathartic. And it's one of the reasons why I think this game is such an interesting way to approach understanding language. And back to the question of language and interaction in this game, and why I'm so interested in collaboratively creating ways of communicating in ways that are possible and helpful, but not necessarily necessary in a game like Journey, is because it illustrates how incredibly adept we are at creating communication. And because we have this natural propensity, it means there's probably something evolutionary going on there. So with all of that in mind, let's look to the mind. Why is it that within this magic circle of gameplay, or whatever you want to call it, we are so easily capable of adapting to a world without words, or language as we would typically know it? Why are we capable of doing this, and why would we have evolved that capacity? Whenever I have a question about human behavior, a good place to start is to consider why would we have evolved that way. And when it comes to our capacity to communicate, it's clear communication facilitates social cohesion. Societies can't really exist without language. But language hasn't always existed, so what about a world before language? Our primate ancestors had vocalizations, as I recently spoke about in my video on memes, but not words. Yet a game like Journey illustrates that we don't really need words to communicate, right? Indicating that some of this capacity to understand simple symbols and collaboratively develop language based on simple vocalizations or gestures still exists in the human mind. So to further understand, let's get those old noggins jogging by looking at research on the brain, language, and social learning. Waldwin, Doing, and Coldwin, 2018, identified a specific area of the brain responsible for understanding human socialization, and were able to isolate one region which is particularly active when viewing a video of others interacting, in comparison to a video of people engaged in solo activities such as walking or riding a bike. This specific region is the posterior superior temporal sulcus, and while sulcus might sound lewd, it just refers to essentially the creases in the cranium. What I found particularly interesting about this, though, is that the same activation occurred when participants watched videos of a simple circular shape which either worked towards solving a puzzle together or acted independently. And while the same region was slightly more active when the circles interacted, the difference was non-significant. But it was more active when participants watched the two circles competing against each other to solve a puzzle, rather than collaborating. And while this means that the brain might not pick up extreme abstractions as indicative of socialization, the fact that this region behaved differently when exposed to collaboration versus competitiveness indicates that the brain is able to recognize socialization symbols even when they are extremely abstract, such as a shape, a simple circle. Another area of the brain associated with socialization is the Broca's region, an area of the brain associated with the production of language both spoken and during signing, such that if you have a stroke or otherwise injure this area of your brain, you're likely to end up with some kind of aphasia that will make speaking extremely difficult, if not almost impossible.
I grapple average. Tens are glisten.
He doesn't know that he's saying it wrong?
It all sounds right to him.
An episode of Stargate SG-1, aptly named The Broca Divide, revolves around a disease that basically turns people into cavemen, but silly sci-fi plot aside, the reason for the title is because in addition to also becoming horn dogs completely for normal writing purposes and not at all for fan service, it caused those with the disease to lose their ability to communicate. And specifically, communicate with sound or gestures, not with writing. Writing tends to be centered more in Wernicke's area. But Broca's region has also been shown to be active when people view simple symbols of gesticulation that convey meaning, as found by Fadiga et al., 2006. The same area was active when watching actual humans make social gestures at one another, and when they saw a silhouette of a person making hand animals, but not when they watched a video of an actual animal, indicating there's something about the hand gesture that lights up the language center of the brain.
Would it be okay if you put your hands on top of mine? Like they're
sure,
my hand?
Yeah. Like that?
Yes.
Okay.
That looks like my hands.
Yeah.
We understand that this is a dog, even though it is clearly not a dog, but is the language center that reacts to it. The researchers propose that this finding is evidence that in the ancient past, before the development of speech, now controlled by the Broca's region, was once used to decode meaningful social gestures within groups. Our primate ancestors lacked a descended larynx that would have allowed them to have a vast array of vocalizations that we humans possess, so gestures probably meant a lot in those ancient societies. But this illustrates that very abstract gestures still can convey a complex social meaning. I should note, though, that there are certainly cultural differences when it comes to gesticulation. For example, blue checkmark journalists who continually fall for 4chan pranks aren't the first to be offended by the OK sign. As if you were to travel to Brazil and flash the old white power symbol, you've essentially told them,
"Your mother was a hamster and your father smelt of elderberries."
Anyway, Broca's area, specifically Brodmann's Area 44, may play a role not only in understanding meaningful symbols, but also in imitation behavior in social learning, as was found by Koski et al. 2002, who presented participants with videos of others' hands to see how the brain would respond to mimicking the behaviors of another person. The person in the video moved their fingers in a specific pattern, in some instances just waving them around, and in others pointing towards a small dot which served as a goal to touch. They found that the left and right pars orbicularis of Brodmann's Area 44 within the Broca's region was activated when participants were told to imitate the hand movements in the video when they were striving towards the goal in the form of the dot. In other words, the area of the brain responsible for language production also lights up in response to socialization and is active during imitation and social learning. Heiser et al. 2004 further contend that this area is not just relevant, but is essential for imitation and social learning, and to test this, they had participants again imitate the hand movements of another person, this time trying to press a key on a keyboard, or they used a dot to indicate which key the participant should press. Except this time, they stuck frickin' magnets on either side of the participants' heads and temporarily disrupted function in the left and right pars orbicularis. This is called transcranial magnetic stimulation.
Is there any risk of brain damage?
Well, technically speaking, the procedure is brain damage, but it's on a par with a night of heavy drinking.
Once they'd scrambled their Broca's area a little bit, participants struggled to replicate the hand movements of another person more so than they did in the dot control. They were unable to imitate somebody when this region was interrupted. Remember how damage to the Broca area can make speech incredibly difficult, if not impossible? Well, that potentially extends to social imitation and social learning, as well as language production and socialization comprehension.
I'm still figuring out the language. This is usually when we start playing charades.
But what all of this means is that language and social learning are inherently connected. To take another example from television, this ability for two people who do not understand each other on a basic level to create mutual levels of comprehension via interaction is perfectly illustrated in the classic Star Trek Next Gen episode Darmok, wherein Captain Picard and the captain of an alien vessel, a race that speaks entirely in metaphors, which is obviously not functional and pants on head, but good for making a point, and it's not like Star Trek has ever been subtle when it comes to exploring social issues or anything. But that point is that two people with no shared tongue can find a way to adapt to one another when the purpose is to work collaboratively towards a goal.
A metaphor for being alone, isolated. Darmok on the ocean.
Our brains are uniquely designed to understand social information for this purpose, likely having developed a long time before we actually developed language. And Koski et al. Further proposed that their findings, which would extend to the findings of Heiser et al. And so on, everything I've talked about with the Broca's region, may integrate with the still burgeoning research on mirror neurons produced in the F5 region of the premotor cortex, which has been examined in apes, but has not been isolated in man. Rizzolotti and Craig Hero, 2004, proposed that these mirror neurons, which tend to activate in monkeys when they mimic others for the purpose of social learning, may provide more information on how language and gesticulation evolved in humans along with our tendency for social learning through mimicry, specifically when the mimicry serves a purpose to reach a goal. They contend, based on considerable existing research, that the F5 area in the premotor cortex that's been examined in apes is homologous to the pars orbicularis in Brodmann's 44 of the Broca's area. Although the existence of mirror neurons in humans, like I said, is still up for debate, given that we see activation in areas like Broca's regarding language production, understanding of socialization, gesticulation, and imitation, it may be that within the human mind, the regions of language and communication, along with socialization and social learning, are inherently connected. Or at least, they're very closely related. In terms of journey, this may explain how a simple chirp is capable of conveying so much meaning with so little actual data. In addition to body movements such as jumping, another symbol of gesticulation and meaning, there is no other way to communicate beyond this little chirp. And yet players are able to quickly adapt to this most basic of language tools to convey complex meaning, from greetings to celebration to signaling an object needed to progress, or a glyph to collect to get a longer segment of scarf, as well as to warn of danger and illustrate safe passage through an area full of enemies. The same sound, either held or repeated, allows players to communicate with each other, and in this way may also aid in imitation via social learning. And social learning is important because they are collaboratively creating this functional language as they go forward. Our beautiful brains are so complex and so innately drawn towards language that they are able to interpret these simple symbols as a simplistic yet effective linguistic system for the purpose of completing goals, based on just a few moments of interaction to kind of establish the rules, perceiving it as interaction and kind of as language because we have specifically evolved to do so. This chirping system, which is comprehensible by our brains, which are designed to understand communication at even its most basic forms, allows players to aid each other throughout the game experience, at least provided they all go along with the magic circle paradigm and play by the rules. While I would say Journey is unique in that there's little incentive to troll or harm another player, given you can't directly harm them, you can certainly trick another player into running into a monster, but they won't die, their scarf just shrinks. This once again makes Journey a very pro-social game because there isn't much of an opportunity to do any trolling. But there's very little direction given to the player by the developers, so sure, I could see people absolutely doing that. And why would they do that? Although it seems difficult if not impossible to troll in a game like Journey, given its heavily restricted ability to communicate aggressively, with even the most rapid of chirping not being equivalent to trash talking on CSGO.
Good luck, have fun.
Eat dick.
Okay.
As at least I'm still just hearing a tiny little flute sound. and because tricking players into danger doesn't result in a loss or an end state for the other player, this is actually a pretty closed-off magic circle that we find in Journey as a linear experience, with controls that are limited to 2 inputs, flying and chirping. Trolling seems unlikely there, but trolling does exist in pretty much every game, even something that's so pro-social like Journey. And I'm sure that someone has been trolled in this game. But again, why would they? Well, because griefing is something which is pretty much ubiquitous across all online games to a degree, and it's been examined for a long time, dating back to some of the earliest online interactions in multi-user dungeons or MUDs. For you youngins out there, back in the 1980s and early 90s, during the dawn of the internet, people used to hang out in these online text-based chat room/games, usually based on tabletop RPG mechanics. That's right, the first multi-user network relying on bleeding-edge technology in an era before the internet proper was developed by scientists at the University of Essex in 1980. And did they use this technology to solve mathematical problems, to share important scientific data with fellow researchers, connecting the Essex International Network to ARPANET? No, obviously, they used it to play Dungeons & Dragons, nerd.
I won. I won Dungeons & Dragons, and it was advanced!
Well, eventually there were plenty of MUDs floating around in the early web. Eventually MOOs also popped up, which were also sometimes games, but were more often the equivalent of modern chat rooms. Oh god, modern chat room. That's an oxymoron. But even in these basic text-based domains, Bartle 1996 quickly noted that different people tended to have different styles of play, and while he noted that players can move across styles, they tend to have a primary type of preferred playstyle. In his research on MUDs and MOOs, Bartle proposed 4 general player types that exist on an X-axis of more player-oriented or more world-oriented, and a Y-axis of more acting or more interacting orientation, into categories of the following: achievers, explorers, socializers, and killers. Owl the Edge. He suggests that player-based games should emphasize communication between many players, while world-based games should have basic communication allowed for between a few players rather than a lot. Further, interaction can be encouraged by vague amounts of information that encourage exploration, while acting can be encouraged by providing manuals and precise descriptions and directions for the player. In this way, Journey, as its name implies, lies to the far bottom right of Bartle's graph, emphasizing a degree of socialization, kind of, but more likely appealing mostly to the exploration-oriented players among us, rather than griefers or killers. And he notes there are killers extant even in completely social MUDs, trolls who wish to disrupt the social role-playing even if there's no combat, even if there's no skills, including virtual rape and vexatious litigency, which is basically threatening a lawsuit. Explorers tend to be drawn to games that are mostly interactive, and to more world-based games over socialization-based games. In this way, via both its constraints and its freedoms, a game like Journey is unlikely to be plagued by griefing or attract players who tend to prefer killing or a purely social playstyle. More recent research from Banks and Bowman 2016 has expanded upon the player types originally forwarded by Bartle that may affect how people play based on how they perceive their relationship with the character they control, the avatar, with a typology of 4 kinds of relationships that people tend to have with the character that he or she controls. Avatar is object, avatar is me, avatar is symbiote that it's both me and someone else, and avatar is other. That is, the avatar exists outside of the self and your inputs are just helping them along their journey, their quest. They found that people who view their avatars in different ways tend to communicate differently, with these different classifications of relationship to avatars line up with distinct language patterns online. For example, players who tend to view their avatars more as tools, as objects to complete gameplay goals, they tend to use a lot of verbal filler, likes and ums, and they tend to not be interested in talking about much else other than the game. So some people may be more independent explorers according to the Bartle model, or see the avatar more as an object than a representation of themselves or an aspect of themselves, and therefore may choose to progress even without interacting with others in a game like Journey. Thus, while some people may choose to interact and prefer that, the lack of opportunities for griefing creates an environment in a game like Journey where players of different playstyles can potentially still enjoy the experience, whether or not they engage with the social aspects, although again, I highly recommend that you do. But I think there are good reasons why engaging socially in games are likely to enhance this experience, which, as with all games, are arousing to the pleasure center of the brain. It may be unsurprising, but we always have to cite things. Yes, video games cause us to become aroused because they are exciting in nature, and as such, exposure to gameplay is associated with dopamine production, the pleasurable neurotransmitter which is related to feelings of reward, as was found by Cope et al. 1998. They reported that the dopamine response, as measured through a PET scan after 50 minutes of playing a video game, was analogous to being given an injection of amphetamines or methylphenidate, commonly known as Ritalin. Who needs speed when you have need for speed, am I right, fellas?
What was that?
Your reward for clearing the first level.
While I've recently talked about the possible detriments of constantly overstimulating our thalamus to obtain pleasurable dopamine responses, there is something about social games that also makes us and the other player feel better, and that is that social interaction tends to increase our endorphin response. And endorphins reduce perceptions of pain, as was found by Dunbar 2012, in that when people watched a social film, a comedy film, they reported subsequent higher pain tolerance. Unlike other games, particularly other online games with more complex linguistic capabilities to allow us to really shit talk, there's no vent harassment going on in Journey. The potential for pain-relieving endorphin response, and therefore more likely to release endorphins, along with the dopamine we already receive from playing an exciting video game. Although again, I wouldn't recommend overstimulation for a long period of time, this can make the game experience extremely enjoyable. And moreover, being excited playing a video game can also facilitate learning potentially, which would lead more credence to the idea that players are collaboratively creating this language and learning from one another. Evidence for which is found in Bao Chen and Merzenich, 2001, who utilized direct dopamine stimulation by sticking electrodes right into the heads of some rats in association with the sound, and found that they were better learners of associating that sound with a reward. Finally, given that video games used in psychotherapy have been shown in a meta-analysis from Li Feng and Fu 2014 to be moderately effective at reducing reported depression, a single positive experience in a game like Journey may be beneficial, serving as an emotional catharsis both from a tension-relieving dopamine response and socialization-releasing endorphin response. Playing a game like Journey might make us feel a little bit better, even if in the end we do feel sad temporarily, because the end of the game is certainly heart-wrenching, as the player character and their partner, if you have one, with whom you may have been throughout the entire game, experiencing all of it together, the monsters, the frozen hellscapes, or may have only met a few minutes before, are just try desperately to reach the mountain's top, only to falter, their scarf frozen and destroyed from the cold, seemingly lost. But no, after a tense moment, the player rises like a phoenix into the sky, and the music rises similarly, and the visual splendor of the endless cloth creatures that are on the peak are revealed, only for our character and a friend, if we've brought one along, to walk quietly alone into the white abyss. Why would anyone seemingly benefit from this very sad experience? Before I analyze the themes a little bit more heavily, it's pretty obvious that this is a metaphor for accepting death. I don't think you could make it any more obvious. So why would we want to play a game about accepting death? Well, because this is a quintessential example of what Dr. Dolph Zillman described as excitation transfer. He proposed that the anxiety which is experienced during a tumultuous event within media is transferred from sadness into euphoria, tip, when the issue within the narrative is resolved. And although Journey still ends on an arguably sad note, Zillman would posit that the stress that we felt during the lowest point transfers, literally, it transfers into the sky in the case of Journey. This negative energy onto the positive emotion. Our brains are excited, but they can't necessarily differentiate one emotion from another in terms of the extent of that excitement. And thus, sad moments ultimately propel us into greater happiness. There's a lot of critiques of that theory, but it's an interesting lens to look through it by. And it means that the ending may ultimately make us feel better, not just because of the responses of chemicals in the brain, but because of excitation transfer, even though it may bring tears to our eyes.
What is wrong?
Oh, it's nothing. I just got something in my eye.
I thought I could have tied up this section on the mind and the gamer, rise up, nicely here by showing some data that illustrated a connection between cooperative gameplay and the production of one of our other favorite happy hormones, the bonding hormone oxytocin. And I was swindled into reading someone I've probably met in passing's doctoral thesis, which opens with the title, Cooperative Gameplay and Generosity Oxytocin Production as a Causal Mechanism Regarding Prosocial Behavior Resulting from Cooperative Video Game Play, from Grizzard 2013. Sure sounds like I would have found my answer there, doesn't it? But it was not until 75 pages later that he even mentioned that they had bungled the oxytocin saliva samples and they had no data regarding oxytocin.
You swindled me. I was planning to use that money on pots. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to enjoy the one thing you can't swindle for me.
Hey, G, would you make me a sandwich?
No.
Well played, Dr. Grizzard. You swindled me into reading your thesis. Maybe don't put oxytocin and causal link in your title if you have no OT data, but that's just my personal gripe here. While he couldn't provide the OT information, I'll provide an OT-based argument for what he did find. After players worked cooperatively at a game of Rock Band, a game where, like Journey, direct aggression is impossible, they actually expressed less propensity to give a part of their reward for participating in the study to another person. They were less generous. And given that generosity is often associated with oxytocin, the expectation is that as gamers played collaboratively, oxytocin would rise and then generosity would rise. But that's the opposite of what these data actually indicate. Instead, after playing a collaborative game, players were more selfish. And I can't believe I have to do this to your disc, but even without your oxytocin data, the answer to this seemingly conflicting finding that usually oxytocin results in more generosity is explained because that is not unilateral. Although oxytocin increases prosocial behaviors, it does discriminate. Mikolajczyk et al. 2010 found that induced exposure to oxytocin, so they gave them a little snort of the hormone, actually decreased generosity when they believed the other person they were giving towards was a bad actor or might screw them over. And in Grizzard's piece, the participants were told there was a chance that the object of their generosity, the person they're giving it to, could turn down the deal and then neither of them would receive the reward. I think that's a good possible explanation, but until we have more data on oxytocin in response to cooperative gameplay, that's just a theory. No! With what we know now about play itself, about language, about how we come to understand symbols and language and work collaboratively to create them, the mind of players, everything that we've talked about today, let's move into some conclusions about Journey, its place as a game, as a work of art, and as a fascinating case study in minimal communication, as well as the overall meaning of the game. Because I really do have a theory. And I think it can be quite aptly applied to Journey, both thematically and as a case study in minimal vocalization and collaborative language construction. The story of Journey depicts a society in which symbols, words, characters, language is power. It activates the animalistic or naturalistic scarf, which is shown to have been harnessed and used as a power source by those who control language, allowing their society to create an enormous, towering city and monstrous weapons of war. Further evidence for the power of language lies in the white cloak, an indication of status, the leaders of the society. And you too can don a white cloak if you have collected all of the words. And yet Journey is a world without words, because the hubris of those with them use them to mold and harness the natural or unnatural world in this case, to their will, building their civilization to the sky, arguably to God. And thus you, the player, are one of the many people who has been scattered as punishment for your hubris. While on its face there are obvious themes of environmentalism and conservationism, acceptance of death and rebirth, to me, Journey is a story about the power of language, because as we've seen, language is powerful, and we are designed as an animal to seek out symbols and signs of language and socialization to quickly adapt to them and adopt them because it's in our DNA. In that way, even if my interpretation is not the intent of the developers, Journey remains an excellent display of this adaptability in man. I find Journey to be such an excellent exemplar of how we can use limited means to communicate in complex ways, and how a dyad can construct a simplistic but functional language with only the barest of means, particularly because this propensity to communicate and to seek out social information so acutely indicates a very old aspect of our evolutionary psychology that rears itself when you put two people into an environment and tell them to work together, even if they share no language. The need to communicate is so baked into our genes that we can figure out ways to do it with a mere chirp. In a way, all of the divisions of language are erased by allowing players to create their own language, given all the benefits of the endorphins and perhaps the oxytocin, although we don't really know yet, along with the dopamine that we receive as a reward for engaging in an exciting gameplay, but moreover for engaging in social interaction. This is a positive and pleasant experience. And such a connection is likely one of the reasons so many people report a very strong emotional connection with this game, because it is a journey together. And do you think it's really stupid to spend this much time talking about the science behind how we collaboratively create languages, learn socially from one another, and why we're all so driven to interact, all within the context of a 7-year-old 1-hour-long Bing Bing Wahoo? You're right, probably is stupid. Although the study of language itself is certainly not, and of great value to understand how societies function. But further, as we've discussed, play is meaningful. An analysis of play can therefore be meaningful too. But what do you think? Do you think Journey is a similar tale to that of the Tower of Babel? Is Journey even a game? Have you experienced collaborative language construction online? What kind of player out of Bartle's typology do you think you are? How do you relate to your avatar? Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you enjoy my work, you can support me any way you see so fit, either on Patreon, Subscribestar, Streamlabs, or by buying some merch, all linked down below. The description also contains a bunch of links to some of the books that I talked about here today if you're interested in purchasing them. Recently I've been giving out Kindle copies, but the problem is that it's US only, so I don't know if I'm going to keep doing that. But if you follow me on Twitter, sometimes I will give out Kindle books for free. or if you choose to become a Patreon, then I might just post them for you there. As always, thank you so much to all of my incredible supporters on Subscribestar and Patreon and everywhere. Thank you guys so much. Without you, this is completely not tenable for me. I'm truly grateful for your ongoing support. If you want to meet me in real life, I'll be attending the International Conference on Men's Issues and Minds IRL in August. Tickets are linked below. You can get 10% off your ticket for Minds IRL by using the code AIDEN. Finally, if you want to see more of my pedantry for some weird reason, I do play Pathfinder on Nuckalavee's channel, also linked in a card down below, every Tuesday. But don't watch for my sake. Come for our amazing GM Bill. So please come on by and tell Bill what a great GM he is, as well as just a generally great person. Hope to see you there. And as always, all ton of volts.